Hey guys, so this is actually the first video of my new channel, Jimmy Rambles, and I wasn't quite sure what to make a video about. However, I just finished reading a book called Metro 2033. Now, if you followed my gaming channel, Jimmy Burke Gaming at all, you'll probably know that I was actually a huge fan of the games. So you have the books, you have Metro 2033, 2034 and 2035. With the games you've got 2033 and Last Light. However, Last Light is its own original story. Last Light isn't really based on any particular book, whereas the Metro 2033 game does have quite a few things in common with the book. However, I still consider both the book and the game to be very unique experiences. They both have their own content that makes both experiences feel very kind of fresh. So if you've played the game, don't assume that you know everything that happens in the books, because the game, surprisingly, and this is to its credit, the game has a lot of original situations, just a lot of things that are not in the books. A lot of characters that are in the game are in the book, but the way their story plays out might vary quite differently, or just the stations Artyom makes his way through are a lot different to what's in the book. So, however, we're here to talk about the book, not so much the game. And I have to say, overall, this will be a spoiler-free review, just to make that clear. However, overall, I thought this was a pretty good book. Now, just to quickly go back to the game, I did play the game first, and I think the reason it took me so long to finish this book, the thing that was a little bit jarring at first was how slow-paced the book is compared to the game. Now, the game's a first-person shooter. It's obviously going to be a lot more fast-paced than the book. However, it was a little bit jarring at just how few monsters are in the book, at least in the Metro side of things. If you've played the game, it's almost at every single station, every level, you're fighting waves of monsters. It's a lot more subtle in the books, and you could see this as either a bad thing or a good thing. For me, it was just different. But a lot of the time, Artyom doesn't really see any creatures. It's mostly implied. He'll hear strange animal noises off in the distance. Maybe people will disappear at certain points in the story, but Artyom doesn't actually see what exactly happens. Now, when he goes to the surface, that's a different ballgame. The surface segment happens a lot later in the books. In the game, you kind of go back and forth between surface and metro tunnels. Metro tunnels. But in the book, Artyom is primarily in the metro, and he doesn't really go to the surface until later on. That's its own kind of segment. So there is a lot of supernatural elements, however, just like in the game, and it's these kind of supernatural elements that are there instead of all the monsters. There might be some creatures in the books in the metro, however, it's just nowhere near as prevalent as in the game. Now, just to quickly go over the story, I don't want to waste too much time in the story, but it's set in the future, 2033, and at this point there's been nuclear war that has laid waste to Russia at the very least, and this story is set in Moscow, and the survivors have been forced to live in the metro tunnels. My voice keeps cracking for some reason when I say that, but the survivors are forced to live in the metro tunnels because the radiation damage is just so strong that nobody can live on the surface. You've got some irradiated creatures, some strange bizarre things that go on the surface, and it's just inhabitable. There's just no way a human can live there, so they're all forced to live in the metro. And what is interesting about this is that each station is kind of like its own town, and because they're kind of isolated from each other for the most part, each station has its own culture, and this is really where the book kind of shines, because the whole journey is about Artyom travelling through the metro, going through all these different stations. He spent most of his life at this one station called VDNK, and it's currently under attack by some new species of creatures known as the Dark One. So Artyom is entrusted to travel through the metro to the biggest station known as Polis to try and get some reinforcements. And it's less about the Dark Ones and it's more a journey of self-discovery for Artyom. Artyom, as I've mentioned, spends most of his life in the station, VDNK, and so he's really got a very kind of narrow perspective. His initial viewpoint is that, he doesn't believe in anything. Life is chaos. Things have happened because they've happened. There's no use worrying about it. But as he travels through the metro, with each station that he comes across, he meets a wide variety of characters that have their own unique perspective on where they are, why things have turned out the way they have, and what lays in store for them. There's a lot of religious themes and sort of anti-religious themes throughout the story, and as Artyom goes on, his perspective is very much widened, and he really comes to question why things are the way they are. I don't want to spoil anything, as I've said, but there are some characters that are very strongly, they're strong believers of the supernatural. They believe the metro might be a living entity in itself, and that there is no more heaven or hell. Humanity has destroyed them, and so now your soul is essentially trapped within the metro, and that kind of brings us on to the sort of supernatural elements, which can involve people seeing strange visions, hearing bizarre voices, people just instantly losing their mind. And it's less about the monsters, and it's more a case of nobody actually knows what's causing this. Why are people losing their minds? What are these strange voices that people hear? Artyom has somewhat of a resistance to it, so he is able to go through the metro without descending into madness like most other people. However, the supernatural elements are very prevalent throughout the story, and it makes you question just what kind of world Artyom is living in. But then you have people that are sort of old school believers in Christianity, or they've kind of incorporated their own unique religion, and they have their own sort of deities that they believe in. And so for Artyom, it is just very interesting, it's very intriguing to see all these different cultures, and for him, he really needs to try and figure out what is the truth. Are these religions correct, or is it a case of the metro is its own entity, it's a living being, and it's all supernatural forces, or is it a case of life is just chaos, shit happens? So that's the kind of the main theme of the book. It's that journey of self-discovery. It's not like action-packed fighting waves of monsters like the game is. However, there is creatures in the book. There is the supernatural elements I've mentioned. They kind of gradually develop as the book goes on. And it's very effective. What I will say is, because of the pacing, it means that when you do eventually see some creatures, I think it's just very effectively introduced. And, quite a few parts of the book are very atmospheric, and it really makes you kind of think about what's just happened. So, what I will say is, the book is very slow. And, like I said, it was quite jarring comparing it to the fast-paced nature of the game. And there's a lot of times where Artyom will go to a station and he'll speak to different characters, and it will just be screens and screens of monologues, which initially might not seem to have much importance, but that goes back to Artyom kind of discovering different people's way of life and their perspectives. So it might initially seem like a pointless conversation, but the more you think on it, the more meaning that it actually has. But it is very slow paced in that regard, in that it is really about talking to a lot of people, seeing how they're surviving, and then as the book goes on, it gradually builds up steam until eventually, Artyom goes to the surface, and that's where it gets very interesting. So if you've played the game and you're intrigued by the lore of the game, then obviously I have to recommend you read this book. If you've not even played the game, or you've not heard of this book, this has a very kind of down-to-earth, realistic situation in that it is the result of a nuclear holocaust. That is a probable situation in this life. So, in that aspect, it's a case of seeing how humanity adapts. Does humanity actually change as a result of this nuclear holocaust? or is humanity doomed to repeat past mistakes? In that regard, it is very interesting. It's an interesting insight into human nature. But at the same time, you've got that nice kind of edge with the supernatural elements, your irradiated creatures that give it that kind of fantasy aspect. But even so, even with all that, it still feels very down to earth, very gritty, and that kind of kept me hooked throughout the book. So I highly recommend that you read this. As I've said, the game is based on the book, but there is quite a lot of differences between the two, and one of the main attractions was just making the comparisons between the book and the game. Any negatives about the book, I would say it is very slow, which took a bit of getting used to. And also I would say, because this book was originally Russian, it's been translated into English, and as a result there is a lot of typos in this book. Some of them are quite humorous, but during scenes that are supposed to be very serious, maybe where there's action going on or a character's talking and you see these blatant typos, it can sort of pull you out of the immersion a little bit. That's just something to keep in mind when you dive into this book. However, that's my thoughts on it. I was really happy with it. It's got engaging characters. Also, just a final little comparison, Artyom does actually have a personality and character development in the book. In the game, Artyom is pretty much faceless. He doesn't even speak. He is really just the means that you move through the game. In the book, Artyom does very much have a personality, so that is a major plus as well. But if you've read the book, let me know what you guys think, and thanks for watching my first video on my new channel.